This is Biology 2, Chapter 14 on the history of life. In part 2 of this video lecture, we will be taking a look at both some early ideas and some modern ideas on the origins of life. The very earliest of ideas of where all life on Earth came from was a theory in science that is no longer accepted. Again, remember, scientific theories can be modified as new information comes along, and they can also be disproven as new information proves otherwise. So spontaneous generation was the theory that life arises from non-life. So this was in around the mid-1600s. For example, farmers thought that the mice that they had in their fields and in their hay, that the mice themselves actually were birthed from the hay itself. Another example was flies on rotting meat. It was thought at the time that as meat started to rot, that it actually laid the maggot eggs, and flies came from rotting meat. There was a guy by the name of Francisco Redi that tried to disprove this idea that life arises from non-living things. So what he decided to do was he performed an experiment, and he used a control group and an experimental group, which is any good scientist will do. The uncorked flasks were placed, had meat placed inside, so flies could come and go as they please. And then he also had a set of flasks that were corked, so no flies could get in or out. And over time, of course, the uncorked flask had maggots and flies buzzing all over it, and the corked flask did not. The meat was still rotten, but there was no maggots or flies. So this proves that the rotting meat itself does not produce the flies, that other flies actually lay eggs in the rotting meat itself, and then the maggots become flies. However, Redi's ideas of disproving spontaneous generation didn't quite take a hold. Not really until the 1800s do we have what we call the theory of biogenesis developing. The theory of biogenesis states that life comes from life. The microscope, of course, helped us realize this a great deal, that there's life that's smaller than our eye can see. Louis Pasteur was a scientist that demonstrated biogenesis in bacteria. And what he did was he wanted to show that there were actually things, life forms in the air that could affect beef broth. So what he did was he took a special flask, and it was called a swan-necked flask because the top of it kind of looked like a long swan's neck. So in a flask, he put some beef broth, and he sterilized that broth, so he heated it to make sure that all of the microorganisms inside were killed. And he let that flask sit. And as long as the flask stayed upright, the U-shaped bend that you see in the swan-necked flask actually prevented the bacteria from getting into the broth to spoil it. It stayed this way for years. It was sterile indefinitely. Once it was tipped over, or once it was exposed to air, then the bacteria from the air and the dust actually made it spoil and get cloudy, and the bacteria multiply and do their thing, and then the broth becomes spoiled. So again, showing that life comes from living things, that beef broth does not just spontaneously rot on its own, that these things are actually all around us, these bacteria, and that life produces living things. So we have some modern ideas that we'll discuss here. So if life only comes from life, then the big question would be, when and how did the first life appear? That is a very good question that is still attempting to be answered still today. Some early ideas. We have this idea of kind of early Earth, if you remember us talking about that. We have a very hot and toxic environment. We have oceans that are very warm and kind of nutrient filled from all of the minerals from the rocks of the earth. So there's this idea that we call primordial soup hypothesis. Primordial means old or ancient, and the soup kind of refers to kind of the shallow ancient oceans that life perhaps originated there. Another idea that also kind of follows along with this is the deep earth origins of life, where the black smoker communities, those hydrothermal vent communities that we have discovered, where there is no sunlight, there are still food chains and organisms that can live there. So maybe in conjunction or together with this primordial soup hypothesis, kind of this deep ocean life hypothesis kind of tie in together. So we have simple organic molecules that form from chemical reactions. Remember when we talked about chemical reactions, we need some sort of activation energy to get reactants to be made into products. The only source of energy for activation energy at the time on the planet was ultraviolet light. Remember, there is no atmosphere to speak of like we have today, so there is no ozone layer. So all of the ultraviolet light from the sun can reach the surface of the earth. Ultraviolet light is very conducive to mutations in DNA, as well as lightning could have also been another possible primary energy source for chemical reactions. So in order to see if at some point, perhaps, the idea of abiogenesis or spontaneous generation could have occurred. So if we have all of these living things, they had to come from somewhere. So how did all of this organic stuff come together to form living things? Two guys, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, developed a contraption that simulated, as best as we know, kind of the early Earth environment, and they showed and demonstrated that we could make basic amino acids from inorganic compounds. Now remember, amino acids, those are the building blocks of proteins. Proteins is what our DNA makes. So these two guys set out and kind of made this apparatus to simulate the best as they could and the best as we knew how, the early Earth environment. So we have heated ocean water to simulate the oceans and the warm temperatures of those. There was a valve that was put in there to add gases that we believe to be in the early Earth. So methane, ammonia, lots of hydrogen and sulfur compounds. The electrodes kind of simulate the lightning that was present in, and still today present, in early Earth's atmosphere. So then we can cool those gases, and eventually this machine runs and runs and runs, and we get small organic molecules in the form of amino acids. The only problem is those amino acids were very simple, and they wouldn't necessarily stick together. They would come together to form a simple protein, and then they would degrade and fall back into a group of amino acids. So the next question was, okay, if we can make organic molecules from inorganic molecules, how do we get those organic molecules to stay together? A theory on that is for the amino acids, and there have been laboratory experiments to show that this could be a possibility, was that the clay particles in the sediment of the ocean floor perhaps played a role in acting like a glue to keep these amino acids linked together so they could form more complex proteins. There is another theory on origins of life, and we call this the RNA first hypothesis, that perhaps RNA is the first coding system and DNA developed from that. So if we're going to get actual living things, remember the characteristics of life, everything's got to have at least one cell. So how do we get a bunch of organic molecules together to actually form a cell? Well, we're going to have to separate our inside and outside environments. So we are going to need to develop a cell membrane in order to keep inside parts and the outside environment separate so it can maintain homeostasis or maintain that internal balance. There are, well, I won't call them living things because they're not living things. They are what are called coacervates or protobions. And these are molecules that can perform chemical reactions with the help of a membrane. So they're not living, there's no organelles, there's no DNA, there's no RNA. It's simply a phospholipid bilayer with chemicals inside to break down other chemicals. And this was kind of the pre-cell, kind of the stepping stone in order to get actual working cells. More than likely, the first cells on the planet were prokaryotes, bacteria. The oldest prokaryotes, fossilized, that we have found are about 3.5 billion years old. It makes sense logically to have a prokaryotic cell come first because remember, prokaryotes lack a nucleus and a lot of major organelles. So it makes sense to start simple and then kind of upgrade and become more complex as time goes on. The reason why we have the atmosphere that we do today is because of photosynthesizers over the billions of years, taking in the carbon dioxide that was prevalent in the atmosphere and using the sunlight to produce oxygen. Eventually, prokaryotes developed the ability to take in that sunlight and with some chemical reactions, produce some food for themselves. And these are the buggers that gave us our atmosphere. You think, well, how much oxygen can one lowly little prokaryote put out? Well, not a lot, but if you get it together with billions upon billions upon billions of its buddies, and you let that process run for a few billion years, then you can, start to build up your oxygen in the atmosphere. The origins of these different parts of the cell, the organelles. So if we have a cell, if we have a prokaryotic cell without complex parts, how do we get eukaryotic cells with complex parts? There is a theory that's called the endosymbiont theory. Remember, endo means inside, and symbiosis is an association. So this explains the origins of chloroplasts and mitochondria as organelles in the cell. Basically, this shows that, and there has been lab experiments that demonstrate this, that early eukaryotes more than likely were either parasitized or they were consumed by another prokaryote. And the association, the symbiosis started to happen where the consumed prokaryote started or continued to do whatever job it had before. If it was taking sunlight and making food, it would continue to do that while living inside the larger prokaryote. And eventually the symbiosis is working together. The relationship was so important that they could no longer be apart anymore. And so the eventual evolution of chloroplasts and mitochondria as powerhouses of the cell developed more than likely in this way. This has been Biology 2, Chapter 14, Part 2 on the origins of life.